So welcome back. Now we're going to talk about historical conflicts between science and Christianity. We saw in one of the previous presentations how the Bible and Protestant theology influenced the emergence of modern science in a very positive way, and that originally science and Christianity were seen as being going nicely together. That's not what we see today, and so we want to understand how things changed, and I will mention several key events. One is the trial of Galileo and why that was significant. And then there was Charles Darwin publishing The Origin of Species in 1859. And then following that, Thomas Huxley and others formed something called the X Club, which saw a massive shift in the role of science and who got to do science in Victorian Britain. And then in end of the 19th century, there was also in the USA two important developments where two authors, White and Draper, wrote books that claimed that science and Christianity had always been at war with one another. Another event that we won't talk about in detail is the Scopes trial in the USA. But then we'll see in the next unit how things shifted again back to a more positive relationship. But just to set things in motion, I want to look at one Bible verse. So this is a verse in Psalms. I'd encourage you to read the verse in the context of the whole psalm, because it says, "He set the earth on its foundation, it cannot be moved." So it's suggesting that God put the earth where it is and it cannot move. And so I'd like you to think about how you would interpret this verse and why do you interpret that way. And particularly, this verse does suggest that the earth does not move. And so does this contradict the scientific view that the earth revolves around the sun? And this is important because at the time of Galileo, when he was advocating that the earth did revolve around the sun, some people, leaders in the Catholic Church, were claiming that this verse, amongst others, clearly contradicted the science, and so the science must be wrong. So let's talk about Galileo. Just to give you some, just a couple of brief aspects of it. Hopefully you've watched the lecture by Professor Peter Harrison, where he talks about many of the myths about Galileo. But first of all, Galileo, he presented the Copernican theory that the Earth was not the center of the solar system. He presented this as physical reality. That is, that's the way things really were. He didn't present it as merely a mathematical theory. There were people in the Catholic Church, including the Pope, who were comfortable with that idea, that it was just a theory which could account for the data, but that didn't mean that's the way things really were. And that because of this, Galileo became in conflict with the Church, who really had a strong support for Aristotle, as we've pointed out before, and his cosmology, which had the Earth as static and not moving and at the center of the solar system. And so Galileo's claims raised larger questions about who had the right to determine scientific truth. Did individuals have that right, and to go against the view of the Catholic Church? And furthermore, Galileo didn't accept the Catholic Church's interpretation of what were possibly relevant Bible passages, such as this psalm that we just looked at. And so he was in conflict with the church, and particularly this last point about lay people interpreting the Bible, that really, in the time of the Reformation, was creating problems. Now, unfortunately, Galileo was not a diplomat. He was not very diplomatic, and he started out as a friend of Pope Urban VIII, but when Galileo wrote a book to describe the different points of view, the geocentric view and the heliocentric view, so these were the two chief world systems, where the Earth is at the center or the Sun is at the center, he wrote that as a dialogue between two people. And one of the people who was advocating the geocentric view, that the Earth was the center, was named Simplicio, who was a dogmatic fool. And it was clear that this was actually a portrayal of the Pope. So it's not surprising that Galileo's enemies were able to use this and get the church to put him on trial and to convict him of heresy, and for him eventually to be put under house arrest. But there's many other myths and misunderstandings about Galileo that Professor Harrison mentions in his lecture. But that's just some simple background to the case of Galileo. But it's certainly a case where there was direct conflict between the scientists and the church, and unfortunately the church was wrong. But there's more to the story. So turning now to Darwin, we need to put Darwin in context. And so why did Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species have such influence, not just scientifically, but also in theology and the view of whether science was in conflict with theology? So William Paley was an English clergyman who was very influential. He was very interested in natural theology. This is the process where you study nature and science, and from your studies you deduce the existence of God and the attributes of God. And so Paley published a book in 1802 called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity collected from the appearances of nature. Now, this is a very influential book. At Cambridge University, every single undergraduate had to read this book, and that was required reading for more than 50 years. And so one of those people who actually was a student and read the book was Charles Darwin. But later, and so that's the book by Paley. Okay, and so let me just summarize one of the key arguments in Paley's book, and this is called The Argument from Design, and it goes as follows. Suppose you're walking in a field, you're enjoying nature, and then you see a rock on the ground, and you look at the rock and you look at its shape, and you conclude that the rock is just there by chance, and its shape and position has been determined just as a result of random forces such as wind, rain, and heat. Suppose you keep walking and then in the field you also find a watch, a nice pocket watch like the one shown there. And so you open it up and you examine the intricate workings of the watch. It's very impressive, particularly its complexity. Now, what you would naturally conclude is that this watch is not the result of random forces, and particularly it did not spontaneously assemble itself. Rather, the more reasonable and logical conclusion is that the watch must have been created, and particularly it must have been created by some intelligent being, that creator being the watchmaker. And so that was the essence of Paley's argument for the existence of God. And so this was an example of natural theology. And so he considered many examples in nature and was able to argue that it must be that the world was created by God and that the intricacies of biological systems suggested the existence of God. But in due course, Darwin came along and undercut that argument. And so what this led to was a dramatic transformation in science in Britain. So now we come to Charles Darwin and why his publication of The Origin of the Species in 1859 was so important. Well, basically that this theory, the theory presented by Darwin, undermined Paley's argument from design, because Darwin was able to explain incredible biological diversity and the connectedness of a species in terms of their adaptation to the environment and in terms of natural selection. A couple of points worth making is that in the book, Darwin mentions basically creation more than 100 times, and the word evolution never appears. Only what does appear as the very last word in the book is evolved. So Darwin had incredible influence, and this was particularly taken up by a number of passionate people in Britain who were no friend of the church. And so let's look at science in Britain and how it changed from 1800 to about 1900. So around 1800, science was largely done by amateurs. There were no jobs of people who were called scientists. That term did not even exist. People instead did things like natural theology, natural philosophy, and natural history. And this was generally, any sort of research was generally carried out by people of leisure, either who were privately wealthy or were able to attract benefactors. And often, because the Anglican clergy were very much part of the establishment, they were able to attract the necessary funding or patronage. And then science teaching was generally dominated by the clergy. And so if you wanted to be involved in science, you really needed to be part of the in crowd, which was the Anglican Church. Now, 100 years later, things were completely different. There was now a a term for these people. They were called scientists, and it was also not just a hobby, it was an actual profession where people were employed to do scientific research. There were many more scientists. There was a dramatic increase in public spending. Now governments considered it worthwhile to invest money in both the education and research of science. Science also became more specialised, whereas before these gentlemen scientists would dabble in astronomy, biology, geology, a whole range of disciplines. People became more specialised, and science was no longer dominated by the clerics. So what produced this shift? And there's no doubt that Darwin's book and the associated theory of evolution was influential. And partly this was because of one man called Thomas Huxley, who was an agnostic. He was not a member of the Anglican Church, so he was not in crowd, and he was quite hostile to Christianity and considered it opposed to science. And this is an example of the kind of fiery rhetoric he had, which we quoted earlier, where he said, "Distinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science as the strangled snakes beside that of the Greek god Hercules." And history records that whenever science and orthodoxy, as in Orthodox Christian belief, have been fairly opposed, the latter have been forced to retire from the ring, bleeding and crushed, if not annihilated, scotched, if not slain. So Huxley considered that there was this battle going on. It was sort of a fight to the death between science and theology was always losing. And there's various myths about a debate at Oxford between Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce. Both of him here are caricatured in cartoons. But Huxley formed the X Club. This was an exclusive secret society, and its goal was basically to undermine the influence of the Anglican Church, and particularly to stop its influence in science. And so this helped create this idea of conflict, the conflict thesis that science and religion were intrinsically opposed to each other. And this was even encoded further in the USA by two books. One was by John Draper on the history of the conflict between religion and science. The other was by Andrew Dixon White, published in 1896, A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. These books are still in print. You'll find them often still referred to as by atheists in the West as documenting this idea of warfare. The problem is that modern historians, including non-Christians, say that these books are really bad history and they do not accurately represent the relationship between science and Christianity. And even though there's been incidents of conflict, such as with Galileo, they gloss over or ignore that often there's been an incredibly positive relationship between science and Christianity, and they also misrepresent a whole range of historical incidents. But nevertheless, these books have had significant influence to today. So let's wrap up. How did we get to where we are today? Where in the Western world, it's often seen that science and Christianity are in conflict. Well, there are a number of events, and one is of we start with Paley and the argument from design and natural theology. And then Darwin was able to unwittingly show that these arguments were weak, that there were alternative explanations for how biological complexity arose through natural selection over long periods of time. And Huxley and the X Club seized upon this in order to advance their agenda to secularize science. And so science became professionalized, universities became secular, even those that had ties to the church, and this conflict thesis was promoted. We also had methodological naturalism, which is the idea that that you do science by a method that presupposes that supernatural explanations are precluded, and that became philosophical naturalism, that the idea that actually there is no God and God is not acting in the world. And those are two different things. But that's just a sketch of how in the Western world we went from a common view that science and theology went together naturally to today, where in some circles it's viewed that they are in conflict with each other. Thank you.